Hello everyone, this is Irina and Howard from the University of Chester. Welcome back to our mini-series on death, mounds and memory in archaeology and saga literature.
That's right. Previously, we were looking at the King Sagas and the Scandinavian landscape and the interactions between the material remains, the monuments and the texts. But now we're going over to Iceland and the Icelandic sagas and try and do something very similar. And I think Irina's going to be leading it with her reflections, and I'll be just lurking in the background, asking odd questions and musing over these texts. But so where do we begin with this body of literature that is, so rich but frustrating in how we approach it to understand medieval and possibly earlier attitudes and practices towards death and the dead?
Right, so because the Icelandic sagas, the so-called classical sagas, were mainly written in the 13th and 14th century, we don't really regard them as a source for what actually happened, but rather how people interpreted the past. And there are a lot of examples in the sagas about burial mounds, and they often involve also actively interacting with the burial mound, in the sense that there are either people living there or people are doing something around the mound. So the first thing that comes to mind, I think, is the Saga of Grettir, which is quite well known, Grettir the outlaw. And Grettir has two encounters with so-called undead, with the revenants, the afterganger. One of them, the more known one, involves a shepherd, but I'm not going to talk about that one. I'm going to talk about the other one, where he actually goes inside a mound because he seeks some treasure. Yeah, I think that's more relevant to the discussion.
But and it's a good link because it actually happens in Scandinavia, doesn't it? So when he's traveling, so it's kind of links back to, is that true?
This one is not happening in Scandinavia, as a matter of fact. It's on one of the Icelandic islets, and it's very interesting because on this particular island, there is some sort of power struggle, so to speak, and Grettir, by entering this mound, is actually disturbing that, because there is a revenant haunting the island, but he does so for a very specific purpose, which is to protect his son, who is trying to accumulate a lot of resources and power on this island. So he was not really that thrilled that Grettir actually managed to get inside the mound and steal this person's treasure by the name of Kor in Gamlis, or Kor the Old. So what I find interesting in this episode is that it has a lot of folkloristic elements. For example, the glow of a treasure. I don't know, where I grew up, this was sort of like something we had in our own folklore, like where you see something glowing or a fire in the forest, somehow there has to be something buried there. So it's kind of folkloristic. Anyway, so Grettir finds out that there is this mound on the headland. It's also an interesting detail, so it has a prominent position, it can be seen, and he's told by a local farmer, that this is the dwelling place of Kor in Gamlis, or Thorfinn's father. And it is stated that he has been haunting the island, frightening away all the other farmers. So definitely there's a power struggle going on here. And this is all happening under the protection of Kor. That's why Thorfinn hates the fact that Grettir gets involved in this whole story. And then the description tells us that Grettir starts gathering some tools, something to dig with, and also rope, because he wants to get inside this mound. So he basically ignores all this advice, because Grettir, as an outlaw, I think he has problems with his own status, right? I mean, he's desperately trying to, show the community that he can also be a hero, that the curse of Glommer has no effect on him, stuff like that. So he's trying to achieve something by doing that as well. And this is actually sort of a topos in the saga. So this act of going inside a mound is a way to actively interact with the past and trying to get something out of it, some sort of token, some sort of treasure, in order to increase your own status. So even if you don't get anything, the simple fact of going there, it's very much like going on a quest. So it automatically elevates you in some way.
So it says much about him and his ambiguous status as he's already a transgressor and
he's a monster himself. Yeah.
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 So his encounter in the mound is really eerily archaeological. It's detailed, isn't it?
Yes,
and
yes.
Exactly. I mean, not well. We always. I'm looking at this and craving more detail. I'm going. What's that? What's that? What does that mean? How big is this? Where's the space? But it's like any piece of literature. You're trying to. I mean, I always envisage when I read this first as an archaeologist, I imagine a very, very claustrophobic, almost not even a. But when I see, should we say, fantasy reconstructions, as we talked about in the last series, episode, our last video from the Northman, I found it ridiculously capacious. When I was thinking of a much more, almost like you're crawling through the earth and you're backing up against objects, and it's very visceral and tangible and dirty and messy, not some kind of just, it's a bit dusty and a few spooky cobwebs. But everyone's got a different take on this. I don't know how you think about it, but I got the sense that it was a very almost like a spelunking. You're in this dark cave, sort of crawling with space very restricted. I don't know.
It's supposed to be dangerous. It's supposed to be dangerous. It's supposed to be challenging, on the other hand, I do have the feeling that they're quite vaguely described. I mean, vaguely paganisque. Wouldn't designate it as pagan. I would just call it paganisque, because we have details like we have details such as these horse bones, and then there's a chair. So there was a man sitting in it. I think that is archaeologically accurate, though, because we do have burials. I mean, with people actually sitting on the chair. But then we have this vague description of this great treasures, a huge amount of gold and silver, and other elements that are included are, for example, the stench. And this is an interesting aspect because it doesn't necessarily have to do with the stench of the dead. It is also framed as some sort of obstacle. Like you enter the mound, and in other descriptions, there are people who actually die upon feeling the stench. So it's made to look very dangerous and filled with traps. Then there's also the topos of the other people getting frightened, the helpers, I mean, getting frightened and then just leaving the place, and you as a hero, you're left all alone to tackle that. But he tries to get this treasure, and then he is grabbed. He drops it and fights back. They fight back, they wrestle, so there isn't really an encounter in the sense that they start fighting with their swords. But in the end, the sword is used to decapitate the undead. Yeah, so the undead in the sagas are usually decapitated, or more interestingly, they are cremated. And cremated, I've noticed that this is not only applied to the undead, this is also applied to all kinds of characters who are considered to be on the margins of society. Something applied to sorcerers, for example, or all kinds of trollish beings, giants, whatever. So people who are on the margin of society. Otherwise, we don't really have that many references to cremation. I think that would be the only one. But this description is strikes me a bit odd, actually very odd, because usually we have this sort of encounter in the post-classical saga, so the more legendary ones, the ones that deal a lot with the ancient past and from the migration period, for example, and even the ones who are more chivalric, romance-like in style. So for a family saga, this isn't really something that common. The more common episode would be that involving Glommer, I mentioned before. So just like people who are displeased with something and they come back, or people who have been marginalized and suffered a so-called bad death, and then returned, or people who resist the social death, so to speak. So yeah, that sort of description. But yeah, Grettir does manage to get an increase in status following this episode, but unfortunately, this doesn't really save him from his fate. And in the sense, the curse of Glomar, the other revenant, turns out to be very, very prophetic. So he is still an outlaw, he is still a monster, and he is going to struggle with that status until the end of the saga, when he is eventually defeated by some magical machinations. Yeah.
So we do have to remember that we have not only a broader, since the in the last 100 years, we've had a broader corpus of archaeological evidence to show us the variety of different ways in which people are depositing artifacts with the dead, different structures and monuments, but also increasing evidence for medieval people, Viking Age and medieval people, digging into these graves. So we know that grave robbing was a social phenomenon, but that re-entering these graves may have been taking place soon after these burials were taking place, right the way up to centuries later. But also, I don't think I speak totally against the grain of scholarship to say that we've also got to anticipate that people's expectations always, as soon as any grave is shut down or is closed off, within hours, the expectations and imaginations compared with what actually was there and what is actually deposited rapidly spiral. And this is true of all cultures. We even have good antiquarian examples from the late 18th and early 19th century of the timing in the same day that an excavation is taking place, between rumors spreading in the locality that they found a giant, basically because with every retelling within hours of the excavation taking place, this skeleton has grown and grown and grown. And just as one example, and we shouldn't be dismissive of these texts simply for the fact they are not exactly reflecting the archaeological record, because every culture will have this kind of spiraling sort of exaggerations. And so when you see a description like a huge amount of gold and silver, we've never found a burial that fits that description. We've never found a chest full of silver in a burial from the whole of the Viking world. That just doesn't happen. Even the great Oseberg ships and other great burials don't really fit that description, because they were robbed themselves. Now, they may have had those things, but they have been subject to various processes of perhaps, objects being removed very quickly. But I think the other way of looking at it is that, of course, this is about an oral tradition where the story is, simplified, exaggerated in different ways. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so I think what is happening here is rather the way Icelanders in the 30th and 40th century, the authors at least, tried to approach the past, because they're trying to, like you said, to reconstruct a past based partly on history, partly on imagination. So they do have a vague idea of what might have been going on, but then it's always layered. So they don't have any direct memories any longer. We're no longer dealing with the collective memory. So when you have the generations who actually took part in this sort of burial, so you have it all very, very filtered. So it's basically a cultural artifact that they're trying to describe here in the sagas, and they're sort of like making up all these images, like a big kaleidoscope of images, based on these residues of these remnants, these relics of the ancient past, in order to give a sense of continuity of history, in the sense that this is what our ancestors did, and this is what the Christians do now, and this is all part of our history. In that sense, they're also striving to come to terms with the past that was non-Christian, and to integrate that into this broader picture of the Icelandic past.
And these were spaces where, not to contradict myself, but to qualify what I said, is these are clearly spaces where there is we know from the archaeology and these sources the dead are not resting quietly. That if you are, by definition, creating a burial mound, as we discussed last time, you are setting yourself up for various expectations and demands to defend that space, to protect that space. But there is the risk or opportunity, depending on the way you look at it, to reopen those graves. But equally, that having said that, we shouldn't be under the impression that people were spending every second day of their lives messing around in cemeteries. I mean, these were places that were respected and feared. And, the whole point of these kind of stories is these are exceptional peoples doing, things that everyone else would fear to do, not just, daily events. They're supposed to be famed and unusual events, with many different layers of significance and remembrance.
Yeah, they can also be used as reference points in the landscape, and some of them we can identify, others we can't identify, but at any rate, they would have served as some sort of way of remembering the past, in the sense that, this is the field where somebody died, or somebody was buried on this particular headland, and from now on, it carries the name of. In that sense, we're trying to make sense of the landscape as well, so they serve as reference points in the landscape.
So that's Grettir's saga. Is there any more thoughts on that we need to explore, or should we? We're on to a different saga now.
I don't think so. I would like to point out the example of Gunnar from Njol Saga, which is very interesting because it's not really a typical one for the classical sagas. So Gunnar comes back after he dies, after he gets buried in the burial mound. And this episode has a very important narratological function, because basically Gunnar comes back in order to incite Skarphedin and his gang to have their vengeance on his behalf. So he's presented in a very interesting way because he looks quite pleased. He's also not in a corporeal form, which is very interesting. So he's not really physical, as usually the Icelandic revenants are. So he just wanders a bit around his burial mound, doesn't go too far. He starts singing, he's very loud, and he starts reciting a verse. And then we have this whole mysterious atmosphere being described here with the moon, and which was shining brightly, and then there were some shepherds who saw Gunnar, and they go back and first tell the story to his mother, and then she advises them to go to Njol, and they go to Njol, and Njol tells Skarphedin, and Skarphedin goes to Hogni, and Hogni is very skeptical about it. So this also reflects a little bit of tension in society about, should we believe in ghosts, should we not, what does that tell us, and so on. But eventually he does join Skarphedin, and they hear Gunnar reciting this verse, which is very loud, and it's also quite clear in the message. The shield-holding ghost would sooner wear his helmet high than falter in the fray. So this is an allusion to the fact that even after being outlawed, he decided to stay in Iceland. It's also quite a funny story. It's described that he falls, and then he looks at Iceland and he sees the beautiful landscape, and he decides, no, I can't go. Although I am an outlaw, and if I am found, I'm going to be killed. I'm just going to stay here and protect my farm, which he does, and he gets killed because of Hatilgerðar, his wife. Anyway, so he very much uses this occasion and his undeadedness in order to egg on Skarphedin in a very indirect way, in a very poetic way, and convince these characters to go and fight on his behalf. So again, we have this sort of like interesting conversation going on between the past and the present, because I think that's what Gunnar represents. It represents the past that cannot rest in peace, like himself, because he needs a resolution. He needs a resolution for the conflict, and these conflicts, feuds, blood feuds, and so on, they're basically prolonged into this state, into the state of the undead or undeadedness. So it can also be a mark of an unresolved situation going on after death, I think.
And the moon is an interesting feature because it seems to be a certain time. Night is a time where these things happen.
Yep.
But also that reminds me of Grettir Saga and the Curse of Glam, and this idea of the moon and as somehow a point, the light of the moon facilitates that intercession. I don't know if that's something people have discussed.
Yeah, they seem to be very disruptive during nighttime. That is correct. They do tend to return and disturb communities at nighttime, and I think this is also a pan-European motif. If you read the stories related by Tietmar of Merseburg, for example, he has a lot of stories about Christian revenants, as a matter of fact, but not exactly in during the nighttime, but at dawn, rather, when he sees these masses of people gathering and saying their prayers, but they're dead, and they very much scare the communities, and especially the priests trying to engage with them. So the night seems to be, especially the dawn, sort of be like this sort of liminal space where things might happen, things that have to do with ghosts and monstrosity in general. It's an appropriate time for such apparitions.
And it makes me think about the dead. It's not just the fear, it's not just the hated, it's not just the loathed or the other, like Cor the Old is not someone who it is also about people who are known and familiar to those personalities. I think that's another difference here, isn't it? You're dealing with a very sort of a familiar person to those who are witnessing it. It's they know what he looks like, they know his personality. So it's not, but there's skepticism, but it's an aspect of personal relationship played out.
Yeah, right. So they sort of try to preserve a certain aspect of their social identity. So Gunnar doesn't, he's dead, but he doesn't want to be cut out of the story completely. So by this apparition, he essentially tries to show that he is still part of this conflict and he wants to have it resolved, but because he's dead, he has to delegate. But there is some sort of agency still going on after death, at any rate. And it's also interesting for Gunnar because it's again, he's a heroic character and he doesn't really have the same violent nature that many other revenants from the classical sagas have. It usually, again, it's something rather specific to the Fornaldarsögur, the legendary sagas, where you have these heroes from ancient times, either from the Viking Age or from the migration period, coming back and starting to recite, and they have this poetic allure, and they're all very heroic, and they represent these ancient and glorified times. So in the sense, he is quite an unusual figure in the corpus of literature. Yeah.
And I don't know if this is a point worth intervening, and because you're talking about revenants in here, or at least communication with the already dead. But we do actually have in the Icelandic saga some not necessarily common or typical, but some descriptions of funerary practice as remembered or as perceived from the Viking Age as well, don't we? I mean, I with my students, I look at sort of Egil Skallagrimsson saga and the accounts there of how Egil buried his father Skallagrim, and then how he buried his son who died horribly in he was drowned. I find those very interesting because, of course, he buries them together, so years apart. I think his son is buried next to his father, so grandson with grandfather,
right.
And it's very much. I don't know. Haven't read into the textual analysis of this in any way, but I always find it really interesting that there are archaeological, details here. They want to give that sense of pastness. They want to talk about. Let me think about this. Give you an example.
Skallagrim was buried on a headland or something.
Yeah,
there are these details related to these geographical details. In a prominent place, or also on roads, near roads, crossroads, that sort of thing. Yeah.
So they want the audience of the story to sort of get that material sense. Yes, he's buried with his horse, his weapons, his smithy tools.
Yep.
And that is absolutely integral to his personal identity, but also his, as I keep talking about again and again, and no one seems to remember, it's not just about that person, it's about how they were remembered by the audience at the time. And therefore the interment of weapons and horse and smithy tools is not something like personal possessions at all. They are objects that are being remembered as important for Skallagrim's relationship to Egil and Egil's relationship to the audience of his time, and then being remembered through in the oral tradition that is then being passed down. So these objects are they're not just describing things in a passive way, just to say, yeah, he was buried with his favorite watch and his packet of crisps or his favorite snack. They're telling you the things that they know the different audiences would have needed to understand to respect and honor that person. And I think that's really, for me, that's really interesting. And so the fact he puts Bodvar, Skallagrim's grandson, Egil's son, he takes him there and dresses him. They go into the detail of how they dressed him. I think that really shows the importance of material culture for connecting people in the Viking Age, maybe, but it's not so much that. It's about how it's then remembered, of how those acts were seen as acts of care and love and remembrance down the centuries. And I think I find that very interesting. Those details were preserved, not because they're necessarily exactly what happened, but about what they feel people need to hear.
Yeah, it does give a sense of material culture. It does give a sense of how non-Christian practices would have also been integrated into this very Christian world, and more broadly speaking, about social relationships and the way people would have framed social remembrance at the time. And I think there's even the example of Egil himself, who has his bones moved after he dies. So first, I think he's buried in this very pagan way at the beginning, but then his bones are moved, and they're not moved underneath a church. I think it's near the wall of the cemetery or something like that, in this sort of like liminal space, which shows us quite clearly that we are dealing with a world that's trying to define itself, or to define its past a little better at the confluence of these practices between pagan and Christian. Yeah.
But one of the things that would have connected the pagan and Christian is this idea of being finely dressed, because we know from the archaeological evidence of Christian cemeteries from the North Atlantic world, at least I'm immediately thinking of Greenland, but I think also I don't know so much about the Christian era Icelandic burials. Even if they weren't being lavishly dressed with they're not doing sacrifice horses anymore. They're not doing, feasting gear and treasure. The idea of goodly raiment or well dressed, to be well dressed, and it does seem to be a thing that echoes through. Because I know one of the aspects of Egil's funeral is that he's well dressed. He's given goodly raiment. I don't know the exact translation, but from the original. But the idea of respect to the dead is about not simply the care for the body, but the dressing of the body, that sense of placing them. And so, yes, in his original funeral, but then he gets moved again. So yeah, it's these sources for me are not so much about their accuracy to a single moment. It's about how from the very moment of that funeral ever happening, and we are dealing with characters I think we can be sure were historical personages. They're not just fabrications of they are rooted in some kind of historical context, but that it's not about we have a window onto their lives and deaths, but we have a sense of how those societies thought about funerals and thought about the dead. And I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, indeed. And I think the Christian funerals are also sort of vaguely described. I mean, yes, we do have well-dressed people, but then we also have people about whom it is said that they were just buried in a cloth. Or we have more strange apparitions, such as Thorgunna in Erbyggja saga, who shows up as a revenant naked, which is a very interesting detail because it's very difficult to interpret. In one sense, you could say, because in Christian times, it would have been one of the customs would have been just like be buried in a cloth, like without any grave goods and without anything. But then there's also the other interpretation that, her nakedness might suggest her monstrosity, also her sexuality, and maybe some sort of thing that society would have disproved of, that kind of thing. It's kind of like an ambiguous image there. But I think they're more preoccupied, so more than clothing, I think they're preoccupied with where they're buried, because with a lot of these people in the Christian context, it is mentioned that they were either buried under some church or under the wall of the church, or they wanted to be buried on consecrated ground. That's also something you see very often. There is one episode in the Saga of Eric the Red where you have, again, this person coming back, Thorstein, and he comes back in order to tell the others that he wants to be buried on consecrated ground, as it has been done since the Christianization of Greenland. So it's sort of has like a didactic purpose here, like this is the way to bury people, like you should stick to the rules.
Yes, and there is that brings to the fore the idea that they are self-consciously aware of the landscape and the stories of farms that were owned, and these stories would have had no resonance if they weren't connected to the topography and the history of settlement and Christianization. It's all the stories of those individuals are in that meta narrative, aren't they? They're very much thinking in I don't know if it's a bit anachronistic to say, a colonial mindset of they're thinking of place and land claiming, and then the stories of those families and their down the generations.
Yeah, and it has to be in a Christian context. Like this seems to be a milestone in the saga literature. I mean, you can think of at least 3 milestones. You have the settlement period, then you have Christianization, and then you have the integration of Iceland into the Kingdom of Norway in the 13th century. But I think maybe, at least when looking at these scenes and this preoccupation of how to integrate the past, I think Christianization would have definitely represented the most important milestone here, at least if we look at the saga representations, because we have all these mixed signifiers, the pagan, non-pagan, Christian, non-Christian, and so on. And they're trying, the authors, they are trying to like draw a very clear difference between them, like to compartmentalize them, what is pagan and what is Christian. But if you look at an episode such as Thorstein I mentioned before, you're going to notice that there is a tension in accommodating these people and stories, like these older beliefs, in the same context and in the same narrative, definitely.
So what other examples do we have that sort of show the sort of disturbing nature of the dead, or the evocative or monstrous nature of the dead, or just the complex communications that can happen with these entities?
Yeah, so speaking of this tension between paganism and Christianity, I think it's a very good link here, because there is this, like, I think it's one story that inspired 2 sagas, the Hardar saga first and the Bardar saga Snæfellsnes, the second one.
Okay.
It's a story about, again, it's a story about entering a mound, and it's a story about fighting inside a mound. The details, I think, they're very interesting. So in the Saga of Hord, so they're basically going on a Viking expedition, and they find this monstrous troll, Soti. They hear about him, that again he's holding this great treasure inside a mound. So they decide to take action. And a very interesting detail is that of the mound not opening. This is something you see in the other saga as well. So they keep trying, but the mound won't open. So they need some sort of help, which might come in the form of somebody offering some kind of advice, or an object used to open that. Right.
So in this case, it's the sword that is driven in.
Yeah, in this case, it's the sword. Exactly.
That's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So was it his sword, or is it? Who was?
You have this very strange character called Bjorn, and he's later on interpreted or suspected as being Odin. So it's also something.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah. This
yeah.
I've vaguely I remember reading about this now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Go on. Yeah.
Yeah, Odin, who again has a lot of apparitions in both the classical and post-classical sagas, and with the passage of time, he does appear to be to turn into this malevolent creature, this trickster, trying to prevent people from fulfilling their destiny. But sometimes he can also appear in this position as the helper. And again, I think it's a remnant of the past here. It's a remnant of the ancient past, which can be used both positively and negatively. Yeah, so using this object, they eventually penetrate the mound, and then you have a description of the natural phenomenon going on, so trying to prevent them from getting anything, which I
The
think is also
stench. Yeah.
relevant. Yeah, the stench, you have the earthquake, we have the darkness as well, so all these obstacles. And yeah, what they see is a ship with a lot of treasure, and with this Soti guy standing sitting in the prow. So again, what seems to be a little stereotypical is the way these characters are described. They're described as terrible to look at. We don't really have any concrete description, but they're very terrifying. So again, this could be interpreted as the problematic relationship to the ancient past, which seems both attractive and terrifying at the same time. Attractive because you want something from these characters, which are representative of the ancient times, but at the same time, yeah, you feel the need to like stay put and don't provoke them. It's presented at any rate as having this great magical power. So the mound in itself is a landscape. On the one hand, inviting you to interact with it, but at the same time, sort of like rejecting your presence.
It's
The toppers of the
so.
candle is also quite. I mean, in both stories, you have to have a candle. Speaking of Christianity, it's very present here because you need to have a candle. The candle needs to be lit because otherwise you are going to be overcome by the darkness inside, both figuratively and.
I was thinking about ships here because surely by the 13th, 14th centuries, ships' relationship with the Icelanders was very different from what the settlement or immediately pre-conversion period. I mean, I don't off the top of my head have all the knowledge to present here, but isn't there a sense that the ownership of ships, the control of shipping, and the control of the mercantile activities was almost completely being sort of taken from Icelanders by that point, or was at
Yeah.
least, the ship here is
It's
I
definitely the
think
symbol of authority. So at
it's authority, it's
at that
control.
time,
Yeah, it
yeah.
links to a past time where ships could be disposed of.
Mm-hmm.
Would have been a reality. We have ship burials from Iceland, but
Yep.
also it for the people remembering this story.
They would have been very disconnected.
Yeah, it would be it would feel very alien and disturbing as well as
very foreign indeed. Yeah.
And the horror of looking at the corpse. They never describe it in detail, but we are dealing with societies where death would have been still. I mean, the cliche is that non-Western societies, death is a daily occurrence. Everyone just sees corpses lying around. I mean, that's not true. I mean, yes, of course, young people will perish on a much higher infant mortality than in, say,
Right.
Western developed nations, but still, it would have been a profound and terrifying experience to see a corpse, and to see a corpse in that context would be deeply unsettling for anyone. And so I think we have to sort of. They're not going into great detail, but that would enough just to describing to a group of people in the 13th or 14th century that you could see a corpse within a grave would be a pretty disturbing and exceptional thing. I don't know what people's expectations are amongst the audience, but I think it's important to remember that it's not a Monty Python situation where bring out your dead. I'm not dead. You are. This idea that sort of there's just everyone's just got corpses just hanging off the walls and gates and fences of their settlements all the time. I mean, if this was a heavily coded and structured society where respect for and treatment of the dead would have been, very much a concern, and corpses sitting in that limbo between fully gone and there. There's either of an semi-animated in some ways, quite horrific, as
Yeah,
it is in.
Yeah, it would have been an example of monstrosity, I think, from the perspective what you mentioned, because it's not really clearly defined. And yes, it's terrifying, but at the same time, I think in the medieval times, death would have also been perceived more as a process and not something undefined, so something going on for a very long time. And you're really considered dead once all the flesh would have rotten. So at any rate, it would have been something that would have questioned your own assumptions about life and death, like being in a direct interaction with such a character. Yeah.
I love the way it just says, and he was probably Odin. Just like, where has he gone? I don't know. Maybe he was Odin. It just gives me this amusing sort of. Oh, well, that's that then. That explains that.
Yep. Another thing that seems interesting here is the division of treasure, which is also specific to some of the stories. Again, I think it's a preservation here of the older custom of going on a quest or going on a raid, and anyway doing something together with your companions, and what you've gained is not really yours until you've divided it with your fellowship. I think it's an interesting and
I don't want to stretch it too much and say that it is a direct preservation, but we do have sources such as Ibn Fadlan that do talk about the sharing division of inheritance between and so I mean not exactly in the same fashion because it's a division of different resources for the funeral, but it does deaths do and the material inheritance is a complex factor, and even long after the pagan period those decisions of the resources, this does fit with the broader 13th 14th century world across Europe where we're starting to get details and disputes about inheritance and household property, treasure, and so on. So it speaks to a real world, even if it's not necessarily a direct remembrance, because it does give you that tangible connection of what you do with treasure. There's an expectation. If you didn't include that, the story, you can imagine the audience going, well, what happened to all that treasure then? You have to say what happened. It was divided up and everyone was satisfied, and he survived. I like the idea that he stays a year. That's short enough to mean that he's not going to be staying there in that society. I can't remember the broader narrative, but it's long enough to show that they approved of him, because if they can survive a winter and not have a fight, that's a usual sign that Scandinavians are, you're okay then if we can get through a winter without killing each other. Is that a fair estimate, or is that
Yeah, and you get a feeling of great accomplishment. Like every time you find an episode of this sort in the saga, there is this great there's this great honor and courage and a sense of accomplishment that you get from doing this sort of quest. And it's one of the ways of confronting the past, which would have been extremely constructive for you, because you would have gained something tangible out of this whole interaction. I think that mattered quite a lot.
But go on. So we have.
So I think we are the Chester. That means I am at the second saga. Yeah, and I forgot to add the picture. Okay. So this is the other story, which is quite similar, but it also has some details which are really, really interesting. So I said before, it's called the Bardar Saga Snæfellsás, which is a very fascinating story because it has been preserved in later folklore as well. I mean, people nowadays also speak of Bard, who is the protective ghost of the Snæfellsnes Peninsula in Iceland. So this comes from a story related to this person Bardar, who is half man, half troll or giant, or I don't know. It's like troll is a very generic term used for all kinds of creatures in saga literature. We don't really have any criteria for this sort of classification. So anyway, he's a fantastic character, more or less. After his adventures, there is the second part involving his son, who has adventures of his own, and one of them involves his encounter with the king, the Christianizing king, the missionary king, Olaf Tryggvason, and he goes on a quest. And it's very interesting because at the end of the quest, he converts to Christianity. So this seems to have been the purpose of this quest into the pagan world. King Ragnar is mentioned as being the owner of the burial mound they enter. And there is actually a burial mound called the Mound of Ragnar. It is, I think, somewhere in the vicinity of Oslo, in the Akershus municipality, or at any rate, it's very close to the capital. And a lot of legends have been told about this mound over the years. Some of the legends even speak of a relation with like Ragnar Lothbrok. Yeah, Ragni or Ragnar or Ragnvald. Anyway, these are names of semi-legendary or legendary sea kings from the Viking period, and they kind of like developed in the passage of time, and we don't really know who this mound actually belongs to.
No.
But people thought they did. So in the 18th century, in the 19th century, they were very passionate about this mound, and I've read that they even organized some feasts there, some feasts such as Midsummer, or even the National Day of Norway. It was a place of great importance. And at some point, the persons who owned the terrain containing the mound, they even erected like this sort of shrine for their son who died very young. But then people started wondering about the appropriateness of doing that, because allegedly they started seeing a ghost, and they were convinced that this black man they were seeing was this ancient king Ragnar, who was very angry that something was done to his mound. So you see, this kind of story kind of develops with the passage of time in the sort of like folkloristic motif. Right, so Gestur in the story goes to this mound, and about King Ragnar in the saga, we know that he was king of Helluland. It was very important, and he was buried alive along with a lot of people. It would have been quite a huge mound, being buried with 500 men, and with his ship. And yeah, he is othered in the sense that he's described as being a murderer, and he's described as someone whose mound is worth robbing. So this is exactly what Gestur does, but he needs sort of like a team in order to do that, and the team is very interesting. Yeah, so he gets 2 magicians, he gets a priest as well,
Wow.
alongside a lot of warriors. Yeah, and 40 pairs of iron shoes, because they have to cross a lava field. Yes, and there is described that they had
Who
this
does
long
that?
journey.
Who crosses lava? Wow.
Yeah, apparently you can do that if you use iron shoes. Wouldn't recommend it personally.
That doesn't make sense. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not trying it. I'll let someone else try that one. That's not me. Don't do any experimental archaeology, kids. Don't do this at home.
Right. But it's very interesting here. We again find Odin, who is called Raudgrani in the story, but the story here is not really that that positive about Odin, because this time he is overcome by the priest. We do know he is Odin because he's one-eyed and he wears a blue spotted cape. So again, we have this repository of descriptions, like sort of like the primary world, so this world with a lot of motifs and themes where the authors might have gotten their inspiration, and it's also used here. But I think the message is quite clear. You have Jostein the priest, who seems to be this great character and much more helpful than this ancient character from the heathen times. He is eventually yeah, who's eventually he
Then they realised it had to be Odin. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone you don't
Odin,
like, you hit over the head and go, he was Odin. It's a good way of getting away with
belief. Yeah, the heathenish belief is overcome by the priest, who becomes angry, and he uses a crucifix to get rid of this character from the past. And yeah, it's always in relation. So the story is always in relation to the conversion of Gestur, because it's described at the beginning that Gestur didn't really care about the priest, but with the passage of time, he starts doing so once he sees that the priest is the only one capable of dealing with the marvels and miracle and ghosts that start popping out of the grave. Another element here suggesting that is the candle. Again, very symbolic here. So you need to have this candle. It's also in the metaphorical sense. Otherwise, you're going to be overcome by evil. And then there is this lengthy description regarding what they do before they enter the mound and what they do once they are inside the mound. Yes,
Oh, this is complicated.
marvelous. Yeah, yeah. It's a very complicated quest story. So yeah, we have trolls, we have evil spirits, we have fairies. Pretty much everyone. It resembles a little bit the description in the Saga of Hord with all these sort of like paganish elements coming together in order to challenge Gester. And yeah, the priest, apparently nothing happens to him because he's a priest and he's the priest of Olaf Tryggvason, so he has to be the hero in the story. Yeah, and they find this Ragnar lad, and they see the ship and the 500 men. And Gester manages to board it. He has to keep the candlelight, and yeah, he pillages all of the entirety of the ship. And eventually, they also find Ragnar sitting on the chair, and they start wrestling. So really, the author put a great deal of effort in this description. And unlike the other saga, which has sort of like the same narrative style, it adds a lot of elements which clearly point out that this particular saga really has this purpose of showing the Christianization and the mission of Olaf Tryggvason, which has been accomplished, because at the end of the saga, then Gester realizes that Christianity is the right way, and he even starts seeing the image of Olaf Tryggvason, and yeah, and he gives up the pagan preference.
So you have a sort of, I mean, there's some really common themes, even though they're very different stories. The rope, I mean, the scale here, I mean, does 50 fathoms. I mean, is that, yeah, it's fantastical scales of these mounds are opening up to huge caverns beneath the earth in this case, but that's, yeah. It's quite lavish, isn't it? This is Hollywood style. You can see it's ready for.
I think they should make a movie from this for story. It's definitely giving a lot of material.
But
yeah, I do have a couple of other examples from other sagas. So these are the lengthy descriptions, but you have like there are many others. I do like the character of Gunnar, for example, who's described quite interestingly in the saga of the people of Loxdale, so of the Salmon Valley. She's described in a different way in the Book of Settlements, which I find very interesting. So in the Book of Settlements, she's described as wanting to be buried on a high watermark or something of the sort, because she does not want to be buried on consecrated land. On unconsecrated land, sorry. So she is described as more of a Christian.
So there's almost contradictory oral traditions that are playing with that, the tension over her being such an important, prominent, ancestress. Is that a word? Ancestor of the families, and they want to see her as both that kind of the pagan times, but not pagan. She sits in that.
Yeah, so I have the same impression that sometimes the authors don't really know how to integrate these older beliefs in the stories. And yeah, I'm also left wondering when I find Christian descriptions, which are also very vague and superficial. Did they not want to describe them because they were well known, or did they not want to describe them because they were rather more concerned with just remembering their ancestors and without too much detail regarding their concrete burial practices and so on?
But I suppose the question is, I mean, I've been trying to explain this in terms of modern TV shows, which are re-engaging in many ways with a kind of this saga literature style. What I think people need to remember is there's absolutely no reason why you have to show this in terms of plot. Like you look at many other historical representations in Hollywood films and TV series, funerals hardly appear. The choice to put in a funeral into a narrative is a selection. Like you don't have to have the pyramids being built to show ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
It's doing something in the narrative that connects you to that place. Very few, despite our archaeological evidence, people in ancient Egypt weren't spending every day building a tomb or, contribute, but in the same way, in the Viking Age and the Middle Ages, people weren't spending all their time obsessing about funerals. So the choice to put these narratives and integrated into the funerals or the interventions into graves tells us something, just as it does in today's stories, that we have to show a funeral to say goodbye to a character or to mark a particular point of punctuation in a storyline. The revenge is being sought, or whatever it may be. It's important to remember that these are not just accidentally there. And and they're putting a lot of effort into this. So I think this, that is where cultural memory comes in, isn't it? Is that these funerals, people need to have them as an integral part of the story, or the whole story would fall apart. They're the glue, aren't they?
Yeah, someone described it as an imperfect storehouse, like memory in general, and the way memory is constructed is like imperfect storehouse. So some details they're better left aside. Like forgetting is also part of this interpretation, of this sort of construction. So yeah, the way of transmitting the past and using it in the narrative, it's basically validating a vision where they sort of like come together and blend with one another, I think.
And do you have any thoughts? I don't know, maybe you haven't looked into this, but about, obviously we've talked about fear and revulsion and horror, but there's also love and sadness and all the other emotions. I mean, because I was thinking back to Egil and how, he's not a typical character by any means, but after Bodva's death, he refuses to eat, he refuses to drink, he refuses to socialize, and this is part of the story too. It's not supposed to be typical, but it's showing how, it only when he composes his own poem does his dark mood lift, and he was famous for his dark moods. But through that, we do get a sense of perhaps exceptional, but it speaks to a broader fact that people in the past were emotionally engaging with these processes. There was fear and disgust, but there's also love and loss and all of the range of other emotions. I don't know if we perhaps over stylize that or forget that in our discussions.
Yeah, sometimes you find it. Don't know. For example, when there was this character from Hovardar Saga. Yeah, by the same name, the character by the same name. I think he asks for a church to be built on his property or something like that, and it's briefly described that people were sad after his death. But we don't really have, like, I think, that sort of lengthy descriptions about people's grief or
No.
how they react. How they react in terms of emotions when someone dies. It's definitely a good point of research here that needs to be done. But yeah, the general impression is that they don't really insist on that particular sort of thing. I think what they do insist on quite a lot is the disturbance communities suffer when somebody suffers this kind of bad death that they're trying desperately to avoid. So they really insisting on this idea of social cohesion and on economics functionality, and everything has to function when the rituals would have been performed properly. Everything has to be done properly.
Wow, that's been a fantastic excursion. I mean, there's so many themes we could pick up and extend, but perhaps next time we should delve back into some of the archaeology. I mean, I'm not intimately familiar with all the Icelandic burials, but I maybe it should return to me to do some sort of attempt to present some of the burial data.
That would be brilliant. Yes.
Yes. Because you've been taking the weight of the last few sessions and doing the lead on it. If that's okay, that would be maybe that was what we should.
That would be a brilliant continuation. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
we're not for listeners and viewers, we're not haven't got an exact precise plan of what we're doing. We're trying to just have structured but reasonably relaxed conversations here, but to share with you some of our ongoing ideas, and be honest that we don't have all the answers, but that these are fields that are linked to the scholarship, but we're building off. And so, yes,
it's in continuous development, right? I mean, this whole idea of memory and the link between archaeology and literature. I do think that we do need to kind of like bring these areas back together. I do have a feeling that over the past decades they have sort of like been separated again somehow, into everyone doing their own thing without this sort of like bridge between them. Yeah.
So thank you again, Irina, and let's
thank you,
let's
Howard.
leave people. Yeah, thank you. And if anyone watches this and wants to look back at the previous videos, we're showing them across both our channels, which have different audiences, and so you'll find them in both places. And we'll continue this journey next time with some Icelandic burial archaeology, I feel.
So thank you so much for watching. Hope you found out a lot of interesting things about the mountain saga literature, and I'll see you next time with Howard from the University of Chester and Archaeodeath, of course, for a continuation of the conversation, this time with archaeology in Iceland. So it seems to be very exciting.
Thanks, folks.